And so we read from the 9th chapter of Mark, and we start at verse 2 if you'd like to follow along. It's called the Transfiguration. 6 days later, some commentators like to make a big deal out of this. Don't. It's not a big deal unless you are a fundamentalist and you want to argue, because in Luke, by the way, it says that it was 8 days. Split the difference, it'll be 7, which is the biblical number for perfection. So it wasn't 6 and it wasn't 8, it wasn't 7. That's according to my translation of the Bible, which means it doesn't matter. Don't make a big deal out of that. If you want to, you can. Nobody can stop you, but it's not really central to the story here. Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, that does matter, and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. We'll talk about that. And his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. I want to stop there for just a minute. How many of you have heard much about the disciple Peter before? What do you know about Peter? Anything? Peter was somebody who talked when he should have shut up. Peter was somebody who talked when he should have listened. And because Peter is so anxious, he says, let's do this. And the reason he did this because he didn't know what to say. And so he had to say something, which is just like Peter. Peter is impetuous. Peter, of course, he is the leader of the gang of 12. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Just a quick look at verse 9 before we move on. He ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is called, it's a fancy term in the Gospel of Mark, messianic secret, which means that Jesus doesn't want to give too much of his identity up until everything that needs to happen happens, including healing, teaching, including crucifixion. So he kind of tells his disciples to put the brakes on because there is a lot more to come. So as we look at this story from the Gospel of Mark today, there's I think a central idea that Mark has for us, and that is listening. So what I'd like to do just as we start this morning is ask you if you could work with me here. Under what circumstances do you find it easy or easier to listen than others? When is it easier for you to listen or relatively easy to listen? What kind of circumstances? Serious circumstances. Okay, they cause you to listen. Others, when is it easy to listen? Quiet. So when it's quiet, easier to listen. Okay? Yeah. One-on-one, it's kind of easier to listen. When the topic is interesting, it's easier to listen. Oh, yeah, when the topic's awkward, that leads me right where I wanted to go, which is to say, those of you who haven't been around know that I haven't been around Epiphany too long, about 10 months, learning a lot. It's a great congregation. I think of myself as a sponge. Well, recently I learned an important lesson about awkward topics. And the lesson was that when our confirmation planning team is meeting, and it's led by that guy, and I'm looking at him, hi Jeff. When that team meets, it's important from time to time for the pastor to be there. If not, here's what happens. I get this email from Jeff. "Pastor, we're covering 3 commandments Sunday night, and here's the one we want you to cover in 30 minutes with 7th and 8th graders. You shall not commit adultery." I know this is going on tape, Jeff. So yeah, it can be awkward. So we're going to have 7th and 8th grade students here with a guy who's a whole lot older than they are. Let's talk about adultery. That's going to be fun. I'm sure they're really going to be listening. La, 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 la. So anyway, yeah. When else is it, how about difficult for you to listen? When's it difficult to listen, Lynn? When's it hard to listen? Chaotic periods? Yeah. Yeah, when we think we know better and know more, what we're doing often in a debate is not listening. We're teeing up our argument. So that I'm going to show you when you're done, David, you're wrong and I wasn't even listening. Wasn't even listening. So yeah, so listening is kind of hard work. It's something to be disciplined about, and that's what's going on in today's reading from Mark. So I want to throw up some titles. Jesus is the Prince of Peace, right? Right? Prince of Peace, we say the name Jesus, right? Jesus, so we listen to him. When you see King of Kings, who do you think of? Jesus, listen to him. When you see Lord of Lords, we think of, again, Jesus. Better, okay? Listen to him. When we see this Son of God, who do you think of? Jesus, that's right. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace, Son of God, listen to him. We're talking about Jesus, right? Nope, we're not. So long before that was the setup you took, but you were listening. Thank you. Thank you for listening closely. So, long before Jesus came along, long before he was born, the names, the titles, Son of God, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace were given to guess who? Caesar. Caesar, the leader of the evil empire of Rome, was called, among other things, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace, Son of God, long before Jesus came along. And so when people heard those names, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace, Son of God, they thought of Caesar. And Caesar was the king of the known world. Caesar was the leader of the empire of Rome. When Caesar spoke, you were to listen, because he was, after all, King of Kings, Prince of Peace, Lord of Lords, Son of God, before Jesus was even born. So Caesar, as the emperor of Rome, and he was called Prince of Peace because he did a good job bringing peace to the world. It was called the Pax Romana. It was the way that Rome ruled the world through Caesar's leadership, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace, Son of God. And so Rome was all about peace. But the problem was this. The Roman Empire was guided by what we call the myth of redemptive violence. And stay with me here because this is really important. So a myth is not a lie. A myth is not a fairy tale. A myth is something that is central and really important in our lives. So in Columbus, many of us live by the myth of the greatness of Ohio State football. That doesn't mean it's a lie. It means it's really important to a lot of people. Some live by the myth that learning is foundational. So it's what gives us purpose and meaning. The myth of redemptive violence was what guided Caesar. So the people worshiped Caesar, all right? And if you listened to Caesar, all was good. But if you didn't, then the Romans would come at you, they would go to war, and then there would be victory because you would be beaten down because you didn't listen the right way, and then there would be peace. That's called redemptive violence. If we're violent enough with these people who don't listen to us, we're going to bring peace, and they will finally fall in line. Listen and obey. That's what it was about with Caesar. And if you didn't, I want you to imagine something with me here. So imagine that you're on Interstate 70, okay? And you get off at Route 256, all right? And you're coming toward, let's say, Old Pickerington. And instead of seeing, Cane's Chicken and Moo Moo and Mod Pizza and Grater's and McDonald's and CVS and all the rest, you're coming down 256, And it's the only way to get into town, if you can pretend that for just a minute. Only way to get into town. And what you see when you come are not all those stores, but you see one cross after another, after another, after another. And it's the only way you can get into town. And you look up and you see your neighbors. You see people from your own family. You see strangers that you barely know. And the reason that all of these crosses are there is because Caesar, the Prince of Peace, wants you to know that if you don't listen, if you don't obey, if you dare to speak up, this is what's going to happen to you. It's capital punishment on display. It's the way that the Roman Empire did things, and that's how Caesar helped people to listen clearly. That's how Caesar helped people to be sure that they stayed in line. And so you would have seen this coming into a lot of towns. It was terrifying. It would make the most, revolutionary person probably sit down and be quiet, because if not, that's what would happen. Meanwhile, here you have Caesar, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace, Son of God. And then there's this thing happening in Galilee. And there is this new teacher. And people are beginning to think that maybe he's the Son of God, Prince of Peace, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and he has a very different vision of life than Caesar does. So, we got the mountaintop experience. Transfiguration Sunday can be so predictable. We're going to go up the mountaintop, but we got to come down into the valley. We're going to have high highs, and we're going to come down low. That's true. That's all true, and that's fine, but it can be so predictable. We see the mountaintop, and we know that the mountain is always a symbol of God's presence. Moses goes up the mountain. Mount Tabor we have here with the Transfiguration and other places. So it is a bit of a mountaintop experience, but we can go deeper than that. So Mark tells us that Peter, James, and John are there, and the English word is transfigured or transfiguration, that Jesus was transfigured before them. It's the best English translation, I guess, we can come up with for the Greek word metamorpho, which sounds like what? Metamorphosis. What happens in metamorphosis? What kind of change happens? So you've got let's say the larva, the chrysalis, and what happens? Out of that comes a butterfly. Was a butterfly always there, or did it appear magically? It was always there. It is kind of magical, but it was always there. The stuff of the butterfly was always there. So metamorphosis is what happens with Jesus and the disciples. If you've heard my preaching, and if you've been here and have happened to listen some of the time, you will notice that I spend a lot of time on the human Jesus, and I think that's important. But what this story challenges us to imagine is that the human Jesus is also the God one, that the divine is in Jesus as the human is in Jesus. And here we have this experience where the glory of God is shown in the human one. The glory of God is shown in the one called the Son of Man. The glory of God blinds the disciples. Have you ever had that kind of experience? And if you have you been afraid to tell people? They might think you're just a little bit whatever. My guess is that some of you, maybe many of us, have had that sense of what the old German theologian Rudolf Otto, you'll want to read his books, they will put you to sleep. But he had this wonderful term he called the mysterium tremendum, which means we're standing in God's mystery and it makes us quake in our feet. Have you ever had that kind of experience with Jesus? And have you been afraid to talk about it? It is profound what happens here on the mountaintop, and it kind of shakes the disciples to their very being, because God's glory is on display in the human one, in Jesus, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace, Son of God. You've got Moses and Elijah there. You've got the whole package. And then they go away. And then from the cloud, you hear this. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Anybody know where we heard these words in the Gospel of Mark before this? Anybody know? Baptism of Jesus. Skies open, Spirit descends like a dove, and there's a voice. This is my Son, the beloved. We're going to go back to that. With you I'm well pleased. God speaks to Jesus, and his baptism happens, and it is an incredible experience. I want to go back to this one verse here. What's interesting in the Gospel of Mark, and I never figured this out until this week, is that the only direct command God gives is on the Mount of Transfiguration when he says, listen to him. It's the only time God speaks directly in the Gospel of Mark. Listen to him. Listen to what he's saying. Listen to what he's teaching you. Listen to how he is healing people. It's the only time God gives a direct command in the Gospel of Mark. Now, there's one more time where we hear this phrase or something like it in the Gospel of Mark. Truly, this was God's Son. Where do we hear that? Anybody know? The crucifixion in the Gospel of Mark. So, I want to say something here, and you might think, what is the big deal? But I think it's a very big deal, and here's what it is. Do you know who spoke those words at the crucifixion? Do you know who spoke those words? A Roman centurion. So by definition, a centurion was what, David? Roman. Okay, so as a Roman, who are you supposed to worship? Caesar. Because Caesar is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Prince of Peace, Son of God. It's a big deal that this Roman soldier gives his allegiance and his trust not to Caesar but to Jesus. That would have been like sedition. So it's an amazing affirmation of faith. Kind of cool, I think, that it's a Roman centurion who understands who Jesus is. So there it is on the cross. So, whose voice are you listening to? This weekend, if you have followed the news at all, you know about what happened in Westerville, right? You know that a couple of police officers responded to a 9/11 call that went silent, and so they went to this apartment complex, and you know what happened. They were doing their job. As the chief of police in New York City said in a tweet, they did not sign up for murder, and no police officer signs up for that. It was awful. Terrible. And behind that is the idea that is too often in our minds that violence is going to solve the problem. That shooting these police officers is going to solve the problem. And it's so deeply embedded in us, and it grabs a hold of us in some very, very destructive ways. And so we see that kind of thing happening. And we wonder why it happens, and yet we know that it is deeply embedded in who we are, and so we are challenged to listen to a different voice. Fortunately, this murderer did not, but we are invited to listen to a different voice. Not the voice of Caesar, which is about violence and punishment, but the voice of Jesus, who leads us in a very different way. Who are we listening to? Whose voice are we listening to? Is it the voice of violent retribution, or is it the voice of peace and even the possibility of forgiveness and new life? So I invite us this morning now to take just about 10 seconds and ask ourselves, whose voice is it that we are listening to, and how might that voice inform the way we live this week? So let's just take 10 seconds to pray and think about that. Dear Jesus, sometimes our hearts are hardened, our eyes are closed, our ears are not able to hear, and so we invite you to come into our lives with all of your glory, with all of your love for us, and help us to listen. Help us to move beyond violence as a response. Help us to be people of compassion and love. Help us to listen to your voice so that we might be your people in the world.